In those subtleties, when they say something about what they're doing or what they're believing, don't say but, say, and I'm also wondering. So it stays positive.
It continues the thought forward rather than creates opposition.
Right, exactly. Yeah. So it's not an argument. It's still a discussion. No one has to be right. No one has to be wrong. And you don't want to come across as being more right. You really want to come across as being someone who's a student. You want to learn from them. But when you're noticing that they are saying something that is in contradiction to something else they said, even in a past conversation or even earlier in the conversation, and that's going to happen because cults and cult teachings are not necessarily logically based, even though they will talk about being logically based. So there are always going to be contradictions where you could point those out. And cult leaders are very clever about making sure that they can write things that are contradictory and get away with it, because if you have a problem with it, it's your problem. And if you're bringing it to someone's attention, you're being negative, or that's your whatever it is, theta, whatever.
It's exactly. In Scientology, it's your reactive mind.
Yeah.
It's your overts. It's your being critical. There's these, again, thought-stopping sort of ideas that are put there that just shut down thinking. So when you're talking to somebody in a situation like this,
right.
It's not a good idea to necessarily attack those, because then they're just going to use those same thought-stopping labels on you.
Yes, right. So if, for example, you say to this person, okay, so I just heard you say that it's fine for you within this group that you're involved with to spend time with your family, and it's never been outrightly kind of reinforced that you can't see your family anymore, and at the same time you haven't been able to come home for any birthday, any anniversary, any funeral, any holiday, so help me understand that. So they might not know how to help you understand that, because they don't understand it themselves, and they're not supposed to question it. But you're helping them see that it doesn't come together. This is an equation that doesn't actually go. And you want to sort of leave that on sort of in their laps. Okay, just think about that.
That's right.
Just notice the dichotomy. Notice the contradiction. And you don't say contradiction, and you don't say dichotomy, and you don't say this doesn't make sense, and you don't criticize it. You just put it out there, kind of in the ether, for them to notice.
I'll just because it's coming to mind right now, I'm going to give an example of this from my own experience that was a very important moment in time for me when I was involved in Scientology, which is a conversation that I had with my mom. Now, my mom had been a Scientologist, and she was, sort of now not so part of the flock anymore. This was even before I was in the Sea Organization, when I was still a staff member in Santa Barbara. And I was having a real hard time with the idea of continuing to be connected to my mom. There wasn't even pressure from the church to get me to stop being in communication with my mother. I was creating my own pressure about it because of her lack of involvement, and it was creating friction. And then one day, I had this conversation with her on the phone. This wasn't even in person, because I wasn't making time to go see her. And I was being sort of abrupt and difficult to talk to with her, and I was really having my issues in continuing to talk to her. But we loved each other. I mean, this was my mother. This was somebody that I was very close to. Still am. She salvaged that relationship between us by pointing out one day on the phone, "Look, Chris, Scientology is all about improving conditions in life, right? And you're supposed to be in better communication with the various aspects and parts of your life as a result of using Scientology. That's true, right?" And of course it's inarguable. Of course that's in the materials of Scientology, that it's supposed to improve your life, and it's supposed to improve your communication. Communication is very important in Scientology. So they say, right? And when she pointed that out, I had to say, well, yes, that's true. And she said, well, look, I'm your mother, you're my son. for the rest of your life and for the rest of mine, we're going to have that relationship. Whether we're in touch or not, I'm always going to be your only mother, and you're always going to be my son. And that transcends anything that you're doing and anything that I'm doing. Mm-hmm. Whether I'm doing Scientology or not, whether you're doing Scientology or not. If Scientology's goal and purpose is to improve our relationship and our communication, then wouldn't it make sense that we would stay in communication, in good communication,
wow. Nice.
Regardless of what I am or am not doing in Scientology, right? And that was inarguable. It was mm-hmm. beautiful logic, and it was such a well-crafted little argument. And I don't know that my mom, spent a lot of time putting that argument together. It just sort of was in the course of our conversation. But it literally was a turning point for me that ended up being a very important thing years later in my mother being, the person that I was never going to stop talking to, because she had put that argument there in such a way that Scientology couldn't break that argument. Because it was made using Scientology, right? It was Scientology principles that made that argument, that made me realize that I needed to continue having a relationship with my own mother, wow. which I had been considering breaking off because of, and only because she wasn't doing Scientology, right? That was my own internal pressure, and of course other Scientologists telling me things that made me think that.
Right.
And, so then for the rest of the years, I joined the Sea organization and moved on up, and very rarely went home to see her or see them. Yet always, called, infrequently, always had a communication line with her. And never considered, years later, when I was in the Sea organization, I was pressured to disconnect from her. And because that argument had been laid so well, I refused to disconnect from her. And in fact, I used the same argument to argue back to the people who were in Scientology. No, why would I do that? That's my mother. She's always going to be my mother. Why would I not want to be in touch with her,
Right.
So these kind of little things, she wasn't trying to get me out of Scientology. She wasn't trying to convince me to stop doing Scientology. But she successfully made it, part of my, Scientology experience that I would always be in touch with her.
Right. I mean, it's a very powerful thing also. It sounds like when you were saying what she said, you were also kind of mimicking how she said it, which was important.
Yeah, that's how the conversation went.
Yeah. So that kind of even tone. And
very much so. There was no yelling, screaming.
Right.
Yeah, no.
Wasn't accusatory.
Right. Very reasoned, very rational. She was upset when we were having that conversation because, I was sitting there telling her, I'm very upset about this. You're not doing Scientology. It's not okay with me. And this had been a point that I'd been harping on for quite some time, right, in conversation after conversation after conversation.
Yeah.
And it came to a head. And rather than react or be very angry with me or, try to, convince me to stop doing that, she convinced me to stop doing that by using the Scientology